July 1572. On the southern horizon, the earth itself seems to move. It is not a storm rolling across the steppe, but a living tide, 120,000 Mongol Horde Horsemen advancing toward Moscow. The ground trembles beneath pounding hooves. Steel flashes in the sun. War cries carry for miles. And the capital still smells of smoke. Just 1 year earlier, in 1571, these same riders burned Moscow to the ground. Tens of thousands were slaughtered. Tens of thousands more were dragged away in chains and sold into slavery. An empire was humiliated in a matter of days. At their head rides Devlet Giroui, Khan of Crimea, backed by the Ottoman Empire, convinced that Russia is finished. This will not be a raid. It will be erasure. But inside the Kremlin, one man is not panicking. Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, has been preparing. He does not intend to defend Moscow. He intends to set a trap, a mobile fortress, a killing ground, a lesson written in blood. The question is simple. Can 25,000 disciplined soldiers stop 120,000 of the most feared cavalry in the world? If you want to see how strategy destroyed supremacy and how a calculated massacre reshaped history, subscribe, turn on notifications, and step into the battlefield. To understand why 120,000 horsemen riding toward Moscow in 1572 felt like the end of the world, you have to go back more than 3 centuries, back to 1237, when the Mongols first arrived in the Russian lands like a force of nature. They did not come as diplomats. They came as a system. Under Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, Mongol armies swept into the fragmented principalities of medieval Rus. These were not unified kingdoms but rival city-states, Vladimir, Ryazan, Kiev, Suzdal, often fighting each other as much as any external threat. The Mongols exploited that division with terrifying efficiency. Their cavalry could move faster than any European army. Their composite bows could kill at full gallop. Their coordination was disciplined, strategic, and relentless. City after city burned. Ryazan fell first, annihilated so completely that chronicles describe the streets running red. Vladimir followed, then Kiev in 1240. The symbolic heart of the old Rus world was reduced to rubble. Entire populations were slaughtered or enslaved. Skilled artisans were deported east. Resistance was not negotiated with. It was erased. But conquest was only phase 1. What followed was something more sophisticated and, in many ways, more devastating. The system historians later called the Mongol yoke. The Mongols did not directly administer most Russian lands. They didn't need to. Instead, they built a tribute machine. Russian princes were allowed to rule, but only if they submitted. Each had to travel to the Khan's court, bow before him, and receive a patent of authority. Power now flowed not from divine right or local legitimacy, but from Mongol approval. Every year, tribute caravans rolled south. Silver, gold, furs, grain, and human beings. The payments were heavy, calculated to extract wealth without completely collapsing productivity. It was domination by design. If a prince delayed or underpaid, Mongol detachments appeared on the horizon with brutal reminders of who held ultimate authority. For entrepreneurs and founders watching this story unfold centuries later, it might resemble a hostile acquisition on a civilizational scale. The Mongols didn't destroy every structure. They absorbed and monetized it. They turned fragmented rivals into revenue streams. But the most psychologically devastating element wasn't economic. It was personal. The Mongols demanded hostages, often the sons of noble families. These boys were sent to the Khan's court, raised in a foreign environment, surrounded by Mongol culture, language, and loyalty. Some were treated well. Some rose in status. But all grew up knowing their father's obedience determined their survival. It was a pressure system designed to eliminate rebellion before it began. Imagine building a future knowing your heir is effectively collateral. This blood tribute reshaped Russian political psychology. It created a generation of rulers who had grown up under Mongol oversight. Some returned hardened and pragmatic. Others returned broken. Either way, the message was clear. defiance meant annihilation, not just for you, but for your family and your city. For over 2 centuries, this arrangement endured. The Golden Horde, as the Western Mongol state became known, dominated the steppe and influenced Eastern Europe's balance of power. Russian princes competed for Mongol favor. Some even used Mongol support to crush their domestic rivals. Collaboration and resistance blurred into survival strategy. But systems built on force eventually face entropy. By the 15th century, the Golden Horde began to fracture under internal power struggles and external pressure. New khanates emerged from its remains, each claiming legitimacy from the old Mongol lineage. Among them were the khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan along the Volga River, and most significantly for Russia's future, the Crimean Khanate to the south. Yet before that fragmentation fully reshaped the map, a pivotal moment arrived in 1480. Ivan III of Moscow, grandfather of Ivan the Terrible, made a decision that would redefine Russian identity. He refused to continue paying tribute. The standoff that followed took place along the Ugar River. Mongol forces and Russian troops faced each other across the water for weeks. There was no grand cavalry charge, no cinematic clash of steel. Instead, there was tension, calculation, waiting, and then the Mongols withdrew. The Great Stand on the Ugar River is often described as the symbolic end of Mongol domination over Russia. No dramatic battlefield victory, just a shift in leverage. The Golden Horde, weakened and divided, no longer had the unified power to enforce its will. Technically, Russia was free, but freedom on paper is not the same as security in reality. The Golden Horde's collapse did not eliminate the threat. It decentralized it. The successor khanates, Kazan, Astrakhan, and especially Crimea, remained militarily formidable. They inherited the steppe warfare tradition, lightning-fast cavalry raids, psychological terror, and a slave economy that fed markets as far away as Constantinople. The Crimean Khanate, under leaders like Devlet Juri in the 16th century, saw itself not as a minor regional state, but as the rightful heir to Mongol power in the region. It was allied with the Ottoman Empire, one of the most powerful empires on earth at the time. Its economy thrived on raiding Slavic lands for captives. Tens of thousands were taken south every year. For Russia, this meant that even after throwing off the yoke, the nightmare never fully ended. Border regions were constantly vulnerable. Villages could be wiped out in days. Young men and women disappeared into slavery. Smoke on the southern horizon became a generational memory. Even when Moscow was growing stronger, expanding, centralizing, it lived with the knowledge that mounted raiders could appear at any time. That is why, in 1571, when the Crimean Khan Devlet Juri successfully burned Moscow, it felt less like an isolated disaster and more like history repeating itself. The old fear had returned. The shadow of the Horde, supposedly defeated in 1480, was standing at the gates again. This is the emotional foundation of the Battle of Molodi in 1572. For the Russian psyche, this wasn't just about territory. It wasn't even just about power. It was about ending a 240-year trauma cycle. It was about proving that the steppe cavalry that once reduced cities to ash could be stopped. Not negotiated with, not paid off, but decisively defeated. The Crimean Khanate represented continuity with a Mongol past. The bloodlines traced back to Genghis Khan. The tactics were inherited. The slave markets still operated. Even if the Golden Horde had fractured politically, its military culture remained alive and lethal. So when Devlet Juri marched north again in 1572 with what chroniclers described as 120,000 horsemen, it wasn't just another campaign. It was an attempt to restore dominance, to reimpose the old order where Moscow bowed and tribute flowed south. And that is why Ivan IV's response mattered so much. This war did not begin in 1572. It began in 1237, when the first Mongol scouts appeared on the horizon. It endured through tribute caravans, hostage sons, burned cities, and fragile standoffs. By the time Ivan the Terrible prepared his defenses at Molodi, he was not simply facing an invading army. He was confronting 3 centuries of inherited fear. What happened next would decide whether that fear continued or finally ended. Ivan IV was not born into stability. He was born into insecurity, suspicion, and violence. And those forces shaped everything he would later become. When Ivan entered the world in 1530, he was the heir to the Grand Duchy of Moscow, a rising power still surrounded by enemies. But at the age of 3, his father died unexpectedly. Power did what power always does in a vacuum. It fractured. Noble families maneuvered, formed alliances, betrayed one another, and treated the young prince less like a future ruler and more like a political inconvenience. By the time Ivan was 8, his mother, his only real protector, was dead as well, likely poisoned. For a child, that kind of environment doesn't simply create fear. It creates memory. Ivan grew up inside the Kremlin watching boyars, Russia's elite nobles, fight for influence. He was neglected, humiliated, and at times openly mistreated. Chronicles suggest he wandered palace halls half-starved while the aristocracy governed in his name. Whether every detail is accurate or embellished, the psychological pattern is clear. He learned early that authority without control is meaningless. That lesson would define him. At 16, Ivan made a move no Russian ruler had ever made before. In 1547, he crowned himself not merely Grand Prince of Moscow, but Tsar of all the Russias. The words are derived from Caesar. It was not a modest upgrade in title. It was a declaration. Ivan was not simply a regional prince. He was claiming imperial legitimacy. He was positioning Moscow as the heir to Rome and Byzantium, as a sovereign equal to any monarch in Europe. For a generation raised under the shadow of Mongol tribute, this mattered. It was branding, but at a civilizational level. Ivan understood optics long before the word existed. Titles shape perception. Perception shapes power. But he didn't stop at symbolism. In 1552, Ivan personally led a massive campaign against the Khanate of Kazan, one of the successor states to the Golden Horde. Kazan had long been a thorn in Moscow's side, launching raids and threatening the Volga trade routes. Rather than negotiate temporary peace, Ivan chose decisive action. He assembled an army estimated at over 100,000 men and marched east. The siege of Kazan was methodical. Russian forces used artillery, sappers, and coordinated infantry assaults. They dug tunnels beneath the city's walls and packed them with gunpowder. When the charges detonated, they tore open breaches large enough for assault columns to storm through. Kazan fell. It was not just a military victory, it was psychological reversal. A former Mongol stronghold was now under Russian control. For years later, in 1556, Astrakhan followed. With both Kazan and Astrakhan subdued, Ivan controlled the entire Volga River corridor, the economic artery of the region. Trade expanded. Territory grew. The steppe frontier began shifting south and east. Russia was no longer merely surviving. It was expanding. These campaigns revealed something important about Ivan. He was not just impulsive or cruel. He could plan. He understood logistics. He recognized the value of artillery and engineering. He was willing to invest in innovation if it delivered results. Yet success did not soften him. It intensified his darker instincts. In 1560, his beloved wife Anastasia died suddenly. Ivan was convinced she had been poisoned by the same boyar elite he had learned to distrust as a child. Whether that suspicion was justified remains debated, but emotionally it confirmed everything he already believed. Betrayal was everywhere. What followed was one of the most infamous chapters in Russian history, the Oprichnina. In 1565, Ivan created a separate political and military apparatus directly loyal to him. The Oprichniki were dressed in black, rode black horses, and carried grotesque symbols, a dog's head and a broom, meant to represent sniffing out treason and sweeping it away. They operated above traditional law. Confiscations, torture, executions, these became tools of governance. Entire regions were terrorized. The city of Novgorod suffered particularly brutal repression. Thousands were executed on suspicion of treason. Property was seized. Families destroyed. The message was unmistakable. Centralized authority would not be challenged. For modern viewers, especially entrepreneurs and founders, this period raises uncomfortable contrasts. On one hand, Ivan was consolidating power, eliminating rival centers of influence, and centralizing administration, moves that in purely structural terms strengthen the state. On the other, the human cost was immense. He was capable of strategic clarity and moral catastrophe in the same breath. But alongside the terror, Ivan pursued reforms that reveal another side of his leadership. He established Russia's first printing press, expanding access to standardized religious and administrative texts. He reorganized the army, creating permanent musket-bearing regiments known as the Streltsy. Unlike feudal levies that disbanded after campaigns, these were standing troops trained in coordinated firearm tactics. This was a crucial shift. The steppe cavalry tradition relied on mobility and mounted archery, but firearms were changing warfare across Europe. Ivan understood that disciplined infantry with muskets could counter cavalry if properly organized and protected. He invested in artillery production. He encouraged fortification engineering. He strengthened centralized command structures. In modern language, he was upgrading the operating system of the Russian military. While European powers were refining pike-and-shot formations, Ivan was adapting those principles to Russia's unique geography: vast plains, forest steppe borders, and constant cavalry threats. He grasped something fundamental. Numerical superiority does not guarantee victory if technology and discipline shift the equation. That mindset would prove decisive in 1572. Ivan's personality was volatile. He could be devoutly religious one moment and explosively violent the next. In 1581, he would famously kill his own son in a fit of rage, a tragic act that symbolized the self-destructive edge of his temperament. But long before that, he had already internalized a harsh lesson from childhood and conquest alike. Weakness invites domination. The Mongol experience had taught Russia what happened when fragmented states faced coordinated force. Ivan refused to allow fragmentation again. His paranoia, while destructive, was also rooted in real historical vulnerability. He had grown up hearing stories of tribute caravans, hostage sons, burned cities. He had seen Kazan and Astrakhan as reminders that Mongol successor states still existed on Russia's borders. So when Devlet-Juri burned Moscow in 1571, Ivan did not interpret it as a random disaster. He saw it as proof that history could reverse itself if he failed. That is why his response in 1572 was not purely emotional retaliation. It was calculated restructuring. He replaced incompetent commanders. He delegated authority to capable generals like Prince Mikhail Vorotensky. He mobilized nobles, peasants, Cossacks, and professional infantry into a coordinated defense. Most importantly, he supported the development and deployment of the Golye Gorod, a mobile wooden fortress designed to neutralize cavalry mobility and amplify firearm advantage. Only a ruler who believed in technological leverage would back such an innovation. Ivan's arc up to this point is not simple heroism. It is contradiction. A traumatized child who became an autocrat. A conqueror who unified territory. A paranoid ruler who unleashed terror. A reformer who modernized the military. A man capable of cruelty, yet also capable of strategic foresight. And it is precisely that mixture, darkness, and capability that sets the stage for Molodi. When 120,000 horsemen advanced toward Moscow in 1572, Ivan was not the naive boy wandering palace corridors. He was a hardened ruler who understood both fear and force. He had expanded his empire. He had crushed internal rivals. He had invested in firearms and discipline. Now he would test whether technology, organization, and relentless resolve could finally end the shadow that had haunted Russia since 1237. The battle ahead would not redeem his brutality, but it would prove something undeniable. Ivan the Terrible was not merely a tyrant. He was a strategist prepared to turn innovation into survival. By 1571, the rivalry between Moscow and the Crimean Khanate was no longer a distant border conflict. It was a test of momentum. Ivan IV had expanded east, broken Kazan and Astrakhan, and projected the image of a rising empire. But to the south, Devlet-Giri was watching carefully and waiting. Devlet was no reckless raider. He was a calculating leader who understood both psychology and timing. The Crimean Khanate's power rested on mobility, slave raids, and Ottoman backing. Every year, thousands of captives from Slavic land were marched south to be sold in Black Sea markets. Raiding was not chaos, it was an economic model. And in 1571, Devlet decided to scale it up dramatically. He began assembling one of the largest forces the steppe had seen in decades. Contemporary sources vary on the numbers, but even conservative estimates point to tens of thousands of mounted warriors, reinforced by Ottoman contingents and artillery. These were not improvised fighters. They were seasoned cavalrymen raised in the saddle, masters of mounted archery and lightning-fast maneuver. Devlet's objective was strategic, not symbolic. He wanted to prove that despite Ivan's conquests along the Volga, Russia remained vulnerable. If Moscow could be humiliated, burned, and looted, then every claim of imperial strength would ring hollow. Investors lose confidence in unstable systems. Devlet intended to expose instability at the heart of Ivan's state. Ivan, for his part, knew the southern frontier was dangerous. He had stationed troops along key crossing points and defensive lines. But here, overconfidence and internal dysfunction began to show. The Russian military apparatus was stretched thin. Ongoing campaigns in Livonia against Sweden and Poland-Lithuania drained attention and resources. Commanders were appointed not only for competence, but for loyalty in a court increasingly shaped by suspicion. Instead of concentrating forces to block a major incursion, Russian defenses were divided. Garrisons were scattered along rivers and fortified towns, each prepared to resist small raids, but not a coordinated, large-scale invasion. Communication was slow. Intelligence was incomplete. Worst of all, Ivan trusted commanders who lacked the decisiveness required to confront a fast-moving cavalry army. Devlet exploited these weaknesses masterfully. In the spring of 1571, the Crimean horde advanced north with astonishing speed. Rather than smash directly into fortified lines, they maneuvered around them. They bypassed strong points, avoided predictable choke points, and cut through less defended terrain. Russian field armies failed to intercept them in time. What had been designed as layered defense became isolated pockets of resistance. By late May, the unthinkable was happening. The road to Moscow lay open. On May 24th, 1571, the Crimean forces reached the outskirts of the capital. Moscow at the time was a sprawling city of wooden buildings surrounding the stone Kremlin. It was densely constructed, vulnerable to fire, and unprepared for a rapid cavalry strike of this magnitude. Devlet did not need to breach every wall. He needed only to ignite. Fires began in the outer districts. Whether started deliberately by Tatar raiders or spread accidentally in the chaos, the result was catastrophic. Strong winds carried flames from house to house. Within hours, entire neighborhoods were ablaze. Panic spread faster than the fire. Residents fled in all directions. Streets clogged with carts, livestock, and desperate families. The Kremlin itself, built of stone, survived, but the city around it became an inferno. Eyewitness accounts describe suffocating smoke, collapsing roofs, and crowds trampled in the rush to escape. Some perished in the flames. Others were cut down outside the walls. Many were captured. Estimates of the dead range widely. Tens of thousands by most contemporary chronicles. Even if exaggerated, the scale of destruction was undeniable. Moscow, the heart of the Russian state, had been reduced to ash in a matter of days, and Devlet did not even attempt to hold it. Occupation would have required supply lines and prolonged engagement. That was not his strategy. He had come to demonstrate vulnerability, extract captives, and shatter confidence. After looting and seizing thousands of prisoners, the Crimean army withdrew south, driving columns of enslaved men, women, and children before them. For Russia, the psychological impact was devastating. This was not a distant border town. This was the capital, the same city from which Ivan had proclaimed himself Tsar, the same city that symbolized centralized power. Now it stood blackened and humiliated. In strategic terms, Devlet had achieved what many European powers had failed to do. He struck at Moscow directly and survived. The message rippled across Eastern Europe. If Russia could not protect its own capital, how secure were its ambitions elsewhere? Inside the Kremlin, the disaster forced hard reflection. Ivan's prior campaigns had demonstrated offensive strength, but 1571 exposed defensive weakness. Divided forces, poor coordination, commanders who reacted too slowly. The system he had built, so effective in siege warfare and expansion, had faltered against rapid steppe maneuver. Failure, for a ruler like Ivan, did not lead to quiet regret. It triggered fury and recalibration. Some commanders were dismissed. Others faced harsher consequences. Blame circulated. But beneath the anger was a sober realization. If the Crimean Khan could burn Moscow once, he could attempt it again. And Devlet ensured that realization lingered. After returning to Crimea with thousands of captives and immense prestige, he sent a message north. Next year, he would come back. Not for a raid, not for plunder, for eradication. Russia would be broken permanently. Tribute would resume. The Tsar would be humbled or destroyed. It was not empty rhetoric. Devlet understood momentum. A second successful invasion in 1572 could collapse Russia's standing entirely. Allies might hesitate. Internal rivals might re-emerge. The narrative of Russian resurgence could unravel. For Ivan, this ultimatum was more than a threat. It was a deadline. He now faced a stark equation. Russia could not survive repeated humiliation at its core. The trauma of Mongol domination still lingered in cultural memory. The yoke had officially ended less than a century earlier. If the Crimean successor state reimposed effective dominance, the last 3 decades of expansion would mean little. The disaster of 1571 stripped away illusion. It proved that artillery victories against Kazan did not automatically secure the steppe frontier. It proved that scattered defenses were insufficient against coordinated mobility. It proved that fear could return quickly if decisive response did not follow. For modern viewers, the lesson feels familiar. Growth can mask structural weakness. Expansion does not guarantee resilience. A single crisis can expose fragile foundations. Ivan understood this intuitively. The burning of Moscow was not merely a military defeat. It was a systems failure, and systems failures demand redesign. Over the winter of 1571 to 1572, reconstruction began, not only of buildings, but of strategy. Command structures were reassessed. Defensive concepts were reimagined. Innovation moved from optional to essential. The humiliation had done something unexpected. It clarified priorities. Survival now outweighed pride. Concentration replaced fragmentation. Technology would be leveraged deliberately, not incidentally. Devlet Giri believed he had demonstrated Russian weakness. In reality, he had triggered adaptation. When the Crimean Horde prepared to ride north again in 1572, they expected fear and disarray. What they would encounter instead was a state that had learned from catastrophe and was preparing not just to defend, but to set a trap. The fire of 1571 had burned Moscow to the ground. It also burned away complacency. The winter after Moscow burned was not a season of mourning. It was a season of calculation. Ivan IV understood something that separates reactive leaders from transformational ones. Catastrophe is data. The disaster of 1571 was not simply a humiliation to avenge. It was a case study to dissect. Why had the Crimean cavalry moved so easily? Why had Russian forces failed to intercept them? Why had the capital stood exposed? The first step was accountability. Commanders who had failed to coordinate defenses were removed. Some were publicly disgraced. Others were quietly exiled to monasteries. A political way of ending careers without creating martyrs. Ivan did not have the luxury of sentimental loyalty. If Russia faced annihilation in 1572, competence would matter more than court politics. In their place, he elevated a man uniquely suited to the coming storm, Prince Mikhail Vorotinsky. Vorotinsky was not chosen for theatrics. He was chosen for experience. A veteran of campaigns against Kazan and other steppe powers, he understood Tatar tactics from hard-earned exposure. He had seen how mounted archers operated, how they feigned retreat, how they exploited panic. Most importantly, he respected them. Underestimation had burned Moscow. That mistake would not be repeated. Ivan gave Vorotinsky broad authority over recruitment, logistics, and tactical planning. The mandate was simple. When Devlet-Giri returned, Russia would not scatter. It would concentrate. Mobilization began immediately. Nobles were summoned to fulfill their military obligations. The Streltsy, Russia's standing musketeer regiments, were reinforced and resupplied. Peasants were drafted and armed. Cossacks from the frontier, hardened by years of steppe skirmishing, were brought into the fold. These men understood cavalry warfare instinctively. They would be essential. Even with aggressive mobilization, the numbers were sobering. At best, Vorotinsky could field roughly 20,000 to 25,000 men. Devlet was expected to bring perhaps 4 or 5 times that number. In open terrain, a direct clash would be suicide. So the question shifted from how do we match their strength to how do we redefine the fight? Here is where innovation entered the equation. The Russians were already familiar with a defensive concept known as the Golye Gorod, literally walking city. In earlier campaigns, it had consisted of large wooden shields or wagon-based barricades used to protect infantry from cavalry charges. But what Vorotinsky envisioned for 1572 was not a simple reuse of old tools. It was an upgrade. Carpenters worked through the cold months constructing modular wooden wall sections, each roughly 3 meters high. These were reinforced with thick timber and, in some cases, metal plating. Each segment was designed with narrow loopholes at staggered heights, perfect for muskets and small cannons. Crucially, the sections could be mounted on wheels or sled runners, allowing rapid assembly and repositioning. When connected, they formed a continuous defensive perimeter, a mobile fortress capable of shielding thousands of infantry. Inside this structure, Streltsy could fire in coordinated volleys, protected from arrows. Light artillery pieces, such as falconets, could be mounted behind the walls to deliver grapeshot into advancing cavalry. Think of it as a 16th century armored formation, mobility combined with protection and firepower. But hardware alone would not win. Vorotinsky conducted a cold assessment of Tatar strengths. The Crimean cavalry thrived on open space. They required room to maneuver, to encircle, to harass with arrows until opponents broke formation. Their entire tactical system depended on inducing panic. Once infantry lines fragmented, cavalry charges became devastating. Remove mobility and suppress panic, and you remove their advantage. The Golye Gorod was designed precisely to do that. It denied cavalry the ability to flank effectively. It turned the battlefield into a controlled corridor of fire. Instead of chasing elusive riders across the steppe, Russian forces would force the enemy to charge into prepared kill zones. But even the best defensive system fails if deployed in the wrong place. Vorotinsky spent weeks studying terrain south of Moscow. The chosen battlefield had to meet strict criteria. It needed to lie along the natural invasion route from Crimea, forcing Devlet to engage rather than bypass it. It required natural obstacles, rivers, forests, uneven ground, that would restrict cavalry maneuver. And it could not appear so impregnable that the Crimean Khan would avoid it altogether. The location selected was near the village of Molodi, roughly 60 kilometers south of Moscow. The area was crisscrossed by small rivers and streams. Dense forest flanked portions of the terrain. Rolling hills offered artillery vantage points. Most importantly, the Pakra River lay behind the prospective defensive line, securing water access and preventing encirclement from the rear. The trap began to take shape. Voritinsky's plan was layered. A forward vanguard of cavalry and light troops would make initial contact with the approaching horde. Their task was not to win. It was to provoke. They would skirmish, inflict limited damage, and then retreat deliberately toward the prepared position at Molodi. To Devlet, this would resemble familiar behavior. Russian forces withdrawing under pressure. Confidence would build. Pursuit would intensify. Momentum would carry the horde straight into the jaws of the Goliagord. Once there, geography would constrict movement. Forests on the flanks, river to the rear, elevated artillery positions overlooking open ground in front. Instead of sweeping encirclement, the Crimean cavalry would face a wall of timber and gunpowder. But one variable remained unpredictable: human psychology. The Goliagord could only function if Russian soldiers held their ground. If they panicked and abandoned the structure under the shock of mass cavalry charges, the system would collapse. The difference between fortress and coffin is discipline. Voritinsky drilled his troops relentlessly. Assembly exercises were repeated until muscle memory replaced hesitation. Units practiced forming defensive lines under simulated stress. Musketeers trained to fire in rotation, one rank discharging while another reloaded. Cannon crews rehearsed rapid repositioning. A simple doctrine was repeated again and again: stay inside the walls. No matter how loud the war cries, no matter how close the riders, do not break formation. Rotational systems were introduced to prevent exhaustion. Fresh units would replace fatigued ones at intervals, maintaining consistent firepower. Supplies of ammunition were stockpiled within the perimeter. Water access via the river ensured sustainability during prolonged engagement. What emerged was not merely a defensive setup, but a controlled environment for attrition. Voritinsky understood that Devlet's army, though massive, relied on speed and morale. If repeated assaults failed and casualties mounted, cohesion would erode. Cavalry armies are powerful when advancing. They're fragile when stalled. The final element was concealment of intent. The Russian position had to appear strong enough to warn engagement, but vulnerable enough to invite attack. Too obvious a fortress, and Devlet might bypass it and strike elsewhere. Too weak a display, and the defensive line could be overwhelmed before its full capacity was tested. It was a delicate balance, projecting opportunity while concealing lethality. By early summer 1572, preparations were complete. Scouts monitored southern approaches. Communication lines were tightened. The Goliagord sections stood ready for rapid deployment. When Ivan visited the camp before returning to Moscow, he was not inspecting a desperate last stand. He was reviewing a calculated system. The humiliation of 1571 had not produced frantic reaction. It had produced strategic redesign. In business terms, the Russian state had pivoted. Devlet Giri would arrive expecting another rapid raid, another burning capital. Instead, he would encounter a battlefield engineered to invert his advantages. Mobility would be trapped. Numerical superiority would be funneled into narrow corridors of fire. Panic would be neutralized by structure. The plan did not rely on bravery alone. It relied on engineering, terrain, discipline, and psychological anticipation. When the horde crossed into Russian territory in late July, they believed they were advancing toward easy plunder. In reality, they were advancing into a system optimized to dismantle them. The trap was not an improvisation. It was the product of winter analysis, leadership restructuring, technological adaptation, and deliberate rehearsal. And if it worked, it would do more than defend Moscow. It would rewrite the balance between cavalry and gunpowder on the Eastern European steppe. At the end of July 1572, the horizon south of Moscow darkened again. Devlet Giri's army moved like a living continent. Tens of thousands of mounted warriors stretching across the steppe, banners snapping in the wind, horses kicking up a permanent haze of dust. They had crossed the Oka River and were advancing with confidence. 1 year earlier, they had burned Moscow. Why should this campaign be any different? On the morning of the first day, near Molodi, The Crimean vanguard made contact with Russian forward units. It unfolded almost exactly as Devlet expected. Light Russian cavalry engaged briefly, fired a few volleys, then began to retreat north. To the Tatars, it looked familiar, another nervous withdrawal. Another enemy unable to stand in open ground. They pursued. What they did not anticipate was what lay beyond that retreat. As the Russian riders pulled back, they passed through openings in a long wooden barrier stretching across the landscape. Gates shut behind them. Suddenly, the Crimean cavalry found themselves facing something entirely new. A continuous wall of timber reinforced and bristling with firearms. Behind narrow loopholes, muskets were already aimed. Small cannons rested on elevated platforms. Voritinsky gave the order. A thunderclap of gunfire tore across the field. Smoke rolled outward. The front ranks of the pursuing cavalry collapsed almost instantly. Horses screaming, riders thrown violently to the ground. Those behind slammed into the fallen. Momentum turned into chaos. For men accustomed to enemies scattering before them, this was disorienting. Instead of a collapsing line, they had charged into a controlled kill zone. By dusk, Devlet had brought forward larger forces. He refused to accept that a wooden structure could halt his army. He ordered successive assault waves, thousands of riders charging at full speed, arrows raining down as they approached. Arrows struck the wooden walls in dense clusters, thudding harmlessly into thick planks. A few slipped through openings, wounding defenders. But when the attackers closed to effective musket range, Russian volleys erupted again and again. At 50 meters, grapeshot from light cannons tore through massed horsemen. Bodies piled in front of the fortifications, forming grotesque obstacles for those behind. Night fell with the Tatars withdrawing to campfires encircling the Russian position. Casualties were already heavy. The Russians had lost men, but nothing like the attackers. The first day ended not with Russian panic, but with Crimean confusion. Day 2 began with escalation. Devlet ordered Ottoman artillery forward. Bronze cannons were positioned within range of the Gulyagord. At sunrise, the bombardment began. Iron balls slammed into wooden sections, splintering timber and occasionally breaching panels. The ground shook with each impact. For a moment, it seemed brute force might succeed where cavalry had failed. But Voritinsky had anticipated this. Critical sections were reinforced. Earthworks absorbed shock. Russian gunners responded with their own artillery, targeting Ottoman batteries. Within hours, several enemy cannons were disabled or forced to withdraw. Then came the Janissaries. Elite Ottoman infantry advanced in disciplined ranks, muskets at the ready. Unlike cavalry, they could sustain organized gunfire. At around 100 meters, they halted and delivered coordinated volleys into the Russian defenses. This was the first time during the battle that the defenders faced sustained musket fire from a professional infantry force. Men fell behind the walls. Smoke thickened. Noise became continuous. When the Janissaries pushed forward with bayonets and ladders, the fighting turned brutal. Some reached the walls, grappling at the top, trying to force openings. For minutes that felt like hours, the outcome hung uncertain. If a section broke, cavalry waiting behind would flood through. Voritinsky shifted reserves quickly. Fresh units reinforced threatened points. Russian cannon crews loaded grapeshot at near point-blank range and fired into dense Ottoman formations clustered at the base of the walls. The effect was catastrophic. Bodies fell in waves. The Janissary assault fractured and then collapsed. By midday of the second day, Devlet had lost thousands more. The walls still stood. Day 3 brought a different tactic, exhaustion. Rather than massive singular assaults, the Crimean command launched rotating attacks throughout the day. 5,000 riders at dawn. Another wave mid-morning. A flanking attempt in the afternoon. Harassment at dusk. The objective was not immediate breakthrough, but attrition, denying the Russians rest, forcing mistakes through fatigue. Inside the Gulyagord, discipline became the decisive factor. Units rotated. Musketeers fired, reloaded, and stepped back while fresh ranks replaced them. Water from the nearby river sustained the defenders. Ammunition was redistributed continuously. The structure absorbed arrow fire. Cavalry charges disintegrated under repeated volleys. Meanwhile, the Crimean camp grew strained. Tens of thousands of men and horses required enormous supplies. Surrounding villages had already been evacuated on Voritinsky's orders. Foraging yielded little. Heat intensified the stench of decaying corpses left on the field. Disease began to spread. Days 4 and 5 saw Devlet attempt full encirclement. Patrols tightened around the Russian position, aiming to starve them out. Night attacks were launched to disrupt sleep. Arrows fired in darkness, shouts intended to provoke panic. But Voritinsky adapted again. Small Russian and Cossack detachments slipped out under cover of night, raiding sections of the Crimean camp. Tents were set ablaze. Guards were cut down silently. Horses were driven off or killed. These strikes were small in scale, but devastating to morale. The besiegers began to feel hunted. Reinforcements managed to reach the Russian position through narrow gaps in the encirclement. Though not massive in number, their arrival signaled resilience. Moscow had not abandoned the field. Then came the turning point. On a fog-laden morning, visibility dropped across the battlefield. Voritinsky seized the opportunity. Before dawn, select Russian units quietly exited the Gulye Gorod and advanced into the Crimean camp. Under cover of mist, they fell upon sleeping soldiers. Muskets fired at close range into tents. Blades cut down disoriented men, scrambling for weapons. Horses panicked. Supply wagons were torched. Confusion multiplied in the limited visibility. For an army reliant on coordination and mobility, sudden chaos in camp was crippling. When the Russians withdrew back to their defenses, they left behind thousands of dead and a shaken enemy. Devlet now faced a dilemma. Reports arrived that another Russian force was approaching from the north. If he committed entirely to crushing the Gulye Gorod, his rear would be exposed. If he diverted troops to intercept reinforcements, his siege would weaken. He chose division. A substantial portion of his army marched north to engage the approaching Russians, while a reduced force maintained pressure on Voritinsky's position. It was a calculated decision, but one made under strain. This is where the trap fully closed. The northern Russian force engaged Devlet's detachment on favorable terrain, forested hills limiting cavalry maneuver. While that fight unfolded, Voritinsky saw his moment. With fewer enemies encircling the Gulye Gorod, he ordered a breakout. The gates opened. Thousands of Russian soldiers surged forward in organized assault. Muskets fired at close range into surprise cavalry. Pikes drove into disordered ranks. The defenders, once stationary, became attackers. The Crimean lines near Molodi buckled quickly. Pursuit began. As Devlet's northern engagement turned costly and he attempted to retreat, the two Russian forces converged. What followed was not an orderly withdrawal, but unraveling. Large cavalry armies, powerful in motion, are vulnerable when cohesion breaks. Retreat became panic. Riders crowded river crossings, trampling one another in desperate attempts to escape. Some drowned under the weight of armor. Others were shot down from riverbanks by musket fire. Forest paths became choke points where Cossack detachments cut down fleeing groups. For kilometers, the pursuit continued. Russian forces showed little mercy. Years of raids, burned villages, and enslaved families fueled relentless aggression. By the time darkness ended the seventh day, the scale of destruction was staggering. Estimates vary, but between 30 and 50,000 Crimean and Allied troops likely perished during the battle and its aftermath. Of the vast army that had advanced confidently toward Moscow, fewer than 20,000 returned to Crimea. Devlet Giri himself escaped with a fraction of his personal guard. His banners, artillery, and supplies were abandoned. The aura of invincibility that had defined steppe dominance for centuries lay shattered on the fields near Molodi. What began as a repeat of 1571 ended as annihilation. Over 7 days, the balance of pressure had escalated relentlessly. Shock, artillery, elite infantry assault, encirclement, exhaustion, until the defenders inverted the equation. The Goliagorod had neutralized mobility. Discipline had absorbed fear. Strategic timing had transformed defense into offense. For Russia, Molodi was not merely a victory. It was the collapse of a long-standing psychological barrier. For the Crimean Khanate, it was a catastrophic loss from which it would never fully recover. The trap had worked, and in working, it reshaped the power dynamics of Eastern Europe. When the smoke cleared at Molodi, the scale of the reversal was almost impossible to process. Prisoners were marched to Moscow in chains. Captured banners and Ottoman artillery were displayed as trophies. Church bells rang for days. A capital that had burned just 1 year earlier now celebrated survival, no domination. In Constantinople, the reaction was colder. The Ottoman court demanded explanations. How had a cavalry force of that size been shattered by a wooden fortress and disciplined musket fire? Support for Crimean grand invasions quietly diminished. The message was clear. The age of unstoppable nomadic cavalry was ending. Gunpowder, organization, and terrain had changed the equation. For Russia, Molodi did more than secure a border. It unlocked momentum. Defensive lines hardened along the southern frontier. Expansion accelerated eastward into Siberia. Within a century, Russia would stretch to the Pacific. The Khan attempted one more weak raid in 1573. It failed. Devlet Giri died in 1577. In 1783, Crimea itself would be annexed into the Russian Empire. The wheel had turned completely. The Goliagorod never became Europe's dominant military model. Geography and shifting tactics limited its spread, but in that decisive moment, it was enough. Innovation under pressure beat scale. Discipline beat terror. Strategy beat reputation. Ivan the Terrible remains a contradiction. Brilliant, brutal, visionary, destructive. But at Molodi, he proved one thing. History does not belong to the largest force. It belongs to those who adapt. If you enjoy stories where strategy reshapes destiny, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join us for the next battle history forgot but shouldn't have.